This video is a prediction about the character I think will come up in the first of the two Inspector Calls questions you get. So, the prediction is Sheila. If Sheila doesn't come up, this essay plan will not be wasted because I'm going to show how it will fit all these themes and also all these other characters. Yes, if another character is mentioned or named, this is still going to be relevant to that character. I know it's going to be amazing. I can't wait to find out how I pull it off. We begin with the thesis statement. In the thesis statement, you explain the writer's purpose. So I'm going to use Sheila to show that the writer's purpose is to encourage everyone in the audience to become a socialist. It's to encourage everyone in the audience, which is largely going to be female because it's 1945 and all the men are still out at war, to rebel against the patriarchy, not by revolution, but by voting for a socialist future, because that's going to align with their interest as women. That's going to be part of the message of the play. But the other message is going to be to explain why the women of Sheila's generation failed. So yes, I'm going to suggest that though Sheila learns the inspector's lesson, ultimately it's a failure because of patriarchal society. So, thesis statement, done. I'm getting high marks because I've looked at the author's point of view. I'm now going to go chronologically through Sheila. We start off with Sheila as a detective. Did you notice that she starts as a detective trying to work out what the hell Gerald has been up to? Actually, she's got a pretty good idea of what he's been up to, but she can't voice it in public and accuse him, but she's letting him know, I know that you know that I know what you've been up to and I'm not going to tolerate it when we get married. Or is she? Because all she says is, that's what you say. Now, the importance of this is it shows that women were in a very vulnerable position back in 1912. Their only way of achieving status in society is through marriage. And for rich women like Sheila, it's no different. She stays at home, she calls mummy and daddy, because she is subservient to her parents. The only way to escape that control is through marriage to someone like Gerald. There's nobody richer in Brumley than Gerald, and so she's in a catch-22 here, especially as we discover later in the play that all the men are just like Gerald. They're all out having affairs. They're all expecting to be able to get away with it. Prince Charles has just married Camilla, like she was his affair ever since he married his wife, Diana. Like, that's just the way things were. Okay, now, when she gets the ring, her attitude changes completely. She talks about never letting it out of my sight and how beautiful it is. And these are the patriarchal values. The ring is a symbol of the wealth and status she's going to acquire by marrying Gerald, even though he is having affairs. But Sheila thinks, well, I'm going to lock onto this ring because the ring will never betray me, which is symbolic of the status I'll get will never betray me. The wealth I'll get will never betray me. I'll just have to put up with the man I've got because that's just what men are like. Then she introduces us to the idea of social responsibility. She points out about Eva and the strikers. They're not cheap labour, they're people. This, of course, is the inspector's message, and the inspector is the proxy for Priestley, so it's also Priestley's message. So, Priestley, glove puppet, Sheila speaks Priestley's words. She represents his views. Why has Priestley given these views to a woman rather than a man? Because you might think, well, society was still pretty sexist in 1945, wasn't it? Men were still treated as socially superior and intellectually superior to women. And the answer is yes. But not so with Priestley. Priestley is saying, no, women are equals to men. Women actually hold the key to a better future because they can now vote. In 1912, no women could vote. Therefore, couldn't change the future. 1945, all women can vote. Millions of them have now been getting jobs for the first time because the men are off rat-a-tat-tat, fighting in the war, and suddenly women are independent. Women are suddenly being perceived as able to do jobs as well as men. The status of women is changing dramatically, and Priestley is saying, you've got that vote, use it to stop this capitalist society that we live in, because he's linking capitalism with exploitation of people, and exploitation of people with exploitation of women. You want to stop exploiting people? Vote socialist. That's his message, and he knows that women are going to change the world. And they did. So, we now get to what Sheila represents. She doesn't just represent all women. This is also a Christian play, because 80% of the audience are Christian, and so Priestley brings in a Christian message. Christian plays were called morality plays. So we go back in time, nobody could read or write except the really rich, and they still had to learn lessons from the Bible. And so how did they teach these lessons? They couldn't read the Bible. They would produce plays in which people played ideas or characteristics, and they were either sins or virtues. Well, you've got the 7 deadly sins, one of which was envy. Sheila represents envy. All the other characters in the play can be said to represent other sins, like pride could be Mrs. Burling, lust could be Eric or Gerald, and so on, okay? So she represents envy, and that's why the inspector says, in a funny way, you could be said to have been jealous of Eva when she got Eva sacked. Jealous, envy, clear link to the morality play. It's important that Sheila has done something wrong so that we can believe in her conversion, and also we can see her conversion as an example to us. So the audience, Priestley is saying, you can make this same journey and convert to a socialist point of view just as Sheila did. And it's much harder for Sheila in 1912, is his implication, than it is for you guys in 1945. He also gives her this word, impertinent, to describe Eva. This is a product of the class system, because Sheila sees herself as worthy of respect, and she's not getting this respect from Eva, she thinks. Therefore, that makes this lower class person, Eva, impertinent. Later in the play, Sheila is going to ridicule her mother for using that same word. She's going to call it silly, impertinent. And Priestley is going to use that to show this journey that Sheila is going on, to tell us to go on the same journey. But he also gives Sheila some patriarchal views. So Sheila felt no guilt about getting Eva sacked at the time, because Eva was highly attractive, and more attractive than Sheila. So she says she looked like she could look after herself. Well, what does she mean? She means your worth as a woman, if it wasn't based on your money, was based on your looks, and also on both. If you were a normal woman from a normal background, the importance of your looks was massive, because you didn't have wealth to attract a husband, you had your appearance. And all of society was geared towards appearance. That's what makeup's for, that's what fashion's for, that's what Instagram's for. So even now, when we've got equality, women are still being controlled by that same patriarchal message. Priestley back in 1945 is saying, look, that patriarchal message is ruining your life, don't do it. Yeah, do not do that. And so his message here is that Sheila has taken on the values of her society, and these values are oppressing her. So in order to become more socialist, she's got to get rid of those values that are oppressing women. Now we're seeing it's a feminist play, as well as a socialist play, as well as a Christian play, and all those three things come through Sheila. That grade 9, it's just falling into your lap, isn't it? Okay, Sheila's the one who tells us about Councillor McGarty at the Palace Bar. She talks about her friend getting her shirt ripped. So this is a sexual assault, potentially, okay? But she's presenting it to us to say, look, it's not just women who need to be paid to have sex. It's not just prostitutes who are visiting the Palace Bar. Well, no, actually, I take that back. This didn't happen at the Palace Bar necessarily, didn't it? So let me go back a step. Prostitutes are the women who are going to the Palace Bar to meet rich men like Eric and Gerald. But Councillor McGarty is also one of these men who's going out looking for prostitutes, but her point is, look, it's not just women of a lower class that are going to face sexual assault. This is something inherent in the way men are treating women in our society. And so now she talks about her friend who went to see Councillor McGarty, probably in an official capacity in his job, and he's he has sexually assaulted her. I mean, now it would be counted as an assault, but he's got away with it. But everybody knows about it because they talk about it amongst themselves. But because he's an important man, he gets away with it. Now, Priestley is putting this in to remind the audience of what women have had to put up with. Remember, it's set in 1912, and so his 1945 audience is getting the message, well, they might have had to accept that then, but let's not accept that now in the modern world. Let's think differently. And of course, Sheila is thinking differently to model to the audience how to do it. Not only is she a protector of her friend, she becomes a protector to her mother. So you remember when Mrs. Burling is talking about girls of that class, saying how, they can't have emotions and real feelings because they're not real people. That's the implication. Well, she says to her mother, you mustn't put up a wall between ourselves and that girl. That's the key quote. You mustn't put up a wall. What she means is, well, of course they're the same as we are. We're all in this together. We're all members of one body. That, of course, is the inspector's message. So Sheila is looking at the class system and saying it's inadequate. It forces us to treat other people as inferior, whereas actually we should all be equal. Once we accept we should all be equal, we're going to vote socialist. Now, she also steps in to protect her mother from Eric's violence. Eric, remember, is very drunk. He was squiffy at the beginning of the play and he keeps drinking. When he finds out that his mother has not given charity to Eva and Eva has committed suicide, so he's lost not only Eva but also his child, he doesn't blame himself for having got Eva in this situation. He blames his mother and he becomes physically violent. Now, that's not in the stage directions. However, it is in Sheila's reaction. Eric, don't! She steps in to stop Eric, and we infer from that he's going to be violent towards his own mother. Remember what Eric said about his first sexual encounter with Eva. He says he was drunk, so he can't remember it all, but then he says, it appears, not taking responsibility, it appears that I was in that state where a chap easily turns nasty. A chap. In other words, all men are potentially going to behave like this when they're drunk. Now, if Eric is behaving like this to his own mother, Priestley's point is, this is what patriarchal society allows. It allows men to abuse women almost unconsciously without even thinking about it. Our warning comes from Sheila. Sheila knows what this society is like, and she is alert to the potential for violence, and so she's communicating to the audience, we seem respectable on the surface, we're all wearing these wonderful Edwardian dinner suits and dresses, but underneath, women are being oppressed and damaged and threatened. This is a big deal, and Priestley wants to change it, so he uses Sheila to do that. She is also Priestley's proxy, and so once the inspector's gone, she says, he inspected us all right. In other words, Sheila is saying, look, all the action on the stage, all the lessons that the inspector taught, we should pay attention to those. Why does Priestley give those words to Sheila instead of Gerald or Eric? Because it's women he wants to reach in the audience. So, she's the one who tells us. That's also going to be really important to explain the two world wars later, so stay tuned for that. Her words about the inspector also tell us how we should react to the way he inspected us. She says, it's what we did. So she's saying, I'm guilty, but we're all guilty. Symbolically, the whole of the ruling classes are guilty for the way they treat the millions of John Smiths and the millions of Eva Smiths. She repeats the inspector's words, fire and blood and anguish. She doesn't repeat the socialist message, the one I've just given you about the millions of John Smiths and Eva Smiths. Why? Because this message is the most important. So she's saying to the audience, look, this isn't just some socialist play, this is also a play about war. Yes, ladies and gentlemen of the audience, the war that we have just lived through, the war that is still going on in the Pacific, the Second World War. But not only that, it's also about the First World War, and it's trying to explain how we got from the war to end all wars, the First World War, to this terrible state, the Second World War, happening again. The First World War didn't end all wars. This is paralleled by the two deaths of Eva. We've got Eva, representing the First World War, dying in 1912, and then we've got the Burlings not learning their lesson, which represents the same as society not learning its lesson and having the Second World War in 1939. Priestley's point is the same capitalist and patriarchal points of view that simply exploited people had no problems with exploiting them in terms of war, sending them off to die. If society had learnt that we are all members of one body and to care for each other, we would never have allowed our ruling classes to take us into war a second time. But we did go into the war a second time. Therefore, when Sheila seems to learn all the lessons of the inspector and Eric seems to learn all the lessons of the inspector, we would expect the next death of Eva not to happen. But the next death does happen. There's the second phone call, which symbolises the Second World War. It happened again. And so the implication is the lesson was not truly learned. With Eric, there are two reasons we can come up with. It's not truly learned, one, because he's been drunk through the whole action of the play, and therefore whatever he says is suspect. He might ditch it in the morning. Or second, he did learn the lesson in 1912, but 1914, he would have been an officer in the First World War, massive number of officers killed. So that generation would not have had an opportunity to carry forward a socialist message. They would have been killed in the trenches, which would have left Gerald and the Burlings and their generation in charge. What about Sheila though? She's not killed in the First World War. Well, Sheila's a woman. Sheila has no power in this society, which brings us to number 10. Gerald says to her, now, what about this ring? He wants to get engaged again because the inspector's not real. And you would think she would turn around and say, no, I've just been explaining how it doesn't matter if the inspector's not real. It doesn't matter if there were different girls and different photographs. He said, none of that matters. What matters is what we did. What matters is how we've all treated other human beings. But instead of saying to Gerald, therefore, no, you've clearly not learned the same lesson I've learned, therefore, I'm not going to put my trust in you. She doesn't say that. She says, no, not yet. She doesn't say it like that, but you know what I mean. It's too soon, I must think. And these are her last words in the play, and it gives us a very strong hint that the only way she's going to be able to escape the influence of her parents is going to be to marry Gerald, or to marry someone else. But the implication from the men that we've met in this play is that whoever else she picks, it's going to be just as bad as Gerald. So, you know, why not go for the one that you love, and the richest one, because they're all going to be like that. The whole ruling class, they're all going to treat women in the same way, and they're all not going to have this idea of social responsibility. So the strong implication here is that Sheila represents women who had to compromise their values because there was no other choice except to remain the property, if you like, of their parents under the control of their fathers. So that gives us the patriarchal control. I've already explained the symbolism of the First and Second World War represented by the two deaths. As soon as the ring is mentioned, the telephone rings. Spooky. And that's deliberate. The telephone rings to say there's another inspector coming, there's been another death, because Priestley is pointing out, because the lesson wasn't learned by those with power, there was a new death, just like there was a new Second World War. Okay, you've got your grade 9 for Sheila. What if Sheila doesn't come up? Let's check it out. Could we write about class? Yes, everything that we've written about Sheila can be turned to class. So patriarchy, that's a product of the class society that values men higher than women. Well, women, yes, if women come up, you're laughing because you can just write about her all the way through. We've got Mrs. Burling that you can write about, and then you just need a little bit about Eva. Well, we've got part of that, about how she was sacked, and you're going to talk about how Eva was sexually exploited by the men, which therefore led to her death. Easy. Social responsibility. Well, everything about Eva here has been about social responsibility or the patriarchy. And when you write about the patriarchy, you're saying, hey, what's stopping men being socially responsible? It's the patriarchal power they've got, and therefore they abuse it. So social responsibility sorted. Socialism, I've talked about that all the way through, haven't I? She is Priestley's mouthpiece. He wants to promote socialism, so all of that relates to socialism. What if we're writing about Mrs. Burling? Okay, well, how much about Mrs. Burling did we discover? We'll have to add in that Mrs. Burling told Sheila, men of business are like that, they're off having affairs is the implication. You'll have to get used to it, just as I did. Mrs. Burling disagrees with that, so you write about how she disagrees with it. She's not part of the younger generation. You can use the impertinent bit to link directly from Sheila to Mrs. Burling, and that discredits Mrs. Burling's views because Sheila does. We can talk about how we're supposed to be sympathetic with Mrs. Burling because Sheila has to protect her from Eric, so Mrs. Burling is still a victim of the patriarchal society. We can talk about Mrs. Burling's views about class and how Sheila wants to change them. It's magic, isn't it, the way this works? Older versus younger generation, that's exactly the same thing that we've just done, contrasting Sheila with Mrs. Burling. And if we have to write about men, brilliant. What does Sheila tell us about men? Oh my God, I'm going to get a grade 9, whatever question comes up, because I've memorised Mr. Salles' plan, and I'm going to chuck in a few ideas of my own. Ka-ching! I'm so excited for you. I almost wish I was sitting the exam for you. Now, if you want to watch a video that explains every single question with a grade 9 response, like not fully written response, but ideas from your friendly English teacher, then that's the video you've got to watch, which is coming up now. Check it out now. It's a real cool video.